Welcome to Norse Mythology, the unofficial guide. It's unofficial because I'm neither a credentialed academic nor a time-traveling medieval Norse pagan, but I deal with this material directly from the sources, interpreted through the lens of the experts and their opinions. If you're looking for depth and detail in a simple and accessible way, then you're in the right place.
Folkvanger níundi, en þar Freyja ræðar sessa kostum í sal. Halven Valhall kus hverjan dag, en halven Óðinn ó. Fólkvangr is the ninth, and there Freya fixes allocation of seats in the hall. Half the slain she chooses every day, and half Óðinn owns. Determining how the afterlife works in Norse mythology is no easy task. At face value, slain warriors are received into Valhall, and everyone else walks the road to hell. And that's hell with one L, by the way. As a reminder, this is not the same thing as the Christian hell. It's more like a generalized Norse underworld. But the sources often hint at a much more nuanced idea. They contain references to undead zombie-like beings and reincarnation, and even things like afterlife halls hidden inside mountains. But one of the most popular and perplexing ideas comes to us entirely by way of the stanza I just recited, which is stanza 14 in the poem Grimnismal. In this section of Grimnismal, Óðinn is enumerating a list of 12 locations wherein different gods live or rule in their various halls or where they own land. The poem doesn't explicitly tell us that this is supposed to be a list of 12 different afterlife locations, but of course Óðinn's hall does so happen to be the most famous afterlife location in the corpus, and it does appear in the list. The list is confusing for various reasons, though. For one, although the poet is attempting to deliver a list of 12 locations, he names 13 of them, and his own count is off by one, starting with the fourth location he mentions, which he describes as the third. There also seems to be some overlap between places in the list. Stanza 6 describes a place called Valaskjolf, for instance, that, quote, the god designed for himself, without noting who the god is. Snorri believes this god is Óðinn, which would indicate that Valaskjolf is another name for Valhall. However, stanza 8 describes another place called Glaðsheimr, where we are told Valhall stands. The point is, it's important to realize that this is a weird list, and not everything mentioned in it is necessarily different from everything else that gets mentioned. And that's going to be important later on. Back in stanza 14, we get a description of a place called Folkvanger, which the poet names as the 9th location, although it actually comes 10th in the list. At face value, this place appears to be ruled by Freya. We are told she determines who sits where in the hall at this location, and that every day she chooses half the slain, and that half are owned by Óðinn. The stanza seems to be telling us that slain warriors are actually divided equally between Óðinn and Freya, with half going to Valhall and the other half joining Freya in another place called Folkvanger. And in fact, this is exactly how Snorri interprets it. In Gylfaginning 24, he tells us that Freya, quote, has a dwelling in heaven called Folkvanger, and wherever she rides into battle, she gets half the slain, and the other half Óðinn, end quote. Unfortunately, this stanza serves as the one and only source for literally everything we know about Folkvanger. Even Snorri's assertion is derived entirely from this quote. And this face value interpretation is hard to reconcile against other information we have about what happens to slain warriors, who we are told time and time again are all received by Óðinn in Valhall. Consider what Snorri says elsewhere in the same book, most clearly in Gylfaginning 38, quote, all those men that have fallen in battle since the beginning of the world have now come to Óðinn in Valhall. Snorri repeats this idea at least one other time, and as we discussed back in episode 11, joining Óðinn in the afterlife looks very much like something a person could expect for themselves simply by dedicating themselves to Óðinn through ritual. The idea that a person's path to Valhall might suddenly be hijacked by being selected by Freya for an alternative afterlife location never seems to appear anywhere else. So what's going on here? How can Óðinn receive all the slain warriors in Valhall if Freya gets to choose half the slain for Folkvanger instead? Well,
In order to properly parse what this stanza is telling us, we're going to need a proper understanding of the phrase, choose the slain. And that means we get to talk a little bit about Valkyries. The Old Norse word that we translate to Valkyrie in English is Valkyria, and it literally means chooser of the slain. The first part of the word, Val, is the same Val that appears in the word Valhall, and it's a word that denotes a dead body on a battlefield. The second part, Kyria, comes from a Proto-Germanic root meaning choice. Snorri introduces us to the concept of Valkyries in Gylfaginning 36, where he comes just short of explicitly calling them minor goddesses. Right after finishing a list of the Óðinn, which are the female Aesir, he says, quote, "There are still others whose function it is to wait in Valhall, serve drink, and look after the tableware and drinking vessels," end quote. He then quotes a stanza from Grimnismal, providing a source for this idea, wherein Óðinn provides some names of Valkyries who serve ale to his fallen warriors in Valhall. And then Snorri goes on to explain, quote, "These are called Valkyries. Óðinn sends them to every battle. They allot death to men and govern victory. Gun and Rota and the youngest Norn, called Skuld, always ride to choose who shall be slain and to govern the killings," end quote. He finishes off this paragraph by noting that Thor's mother Jörð and Vali's mother Rindr are also reckoned among the Óðinn. Both of these are women who appear to have been considered non-members of the Aesir clan originally, but acquired their divine status after having children with Óðinn. The only reason I bring that up here is to show that Snorri's description of Valkyries is firmly couched within his explanation of who the goddesses are. However, even though Snorri mentions a few Valkyries he seems to believe should count as Óðinn, Valkyries are not always goddesses in our sources. In the Helgi poems, as well as in the poem Völundarkvíða and the various stories of Sigurður the Dragonslayer, which now occurs to me we really need to cover on this show, Valkyries tend to be living human women, and particularly daughters of nobles. With regard to one of these women, Brynhildr, we have a ton of really cool information. Brynhildr is rescued from a sleeping spell by the hero Sigurður after he slays a dragon and braves a barrier of fire in a story that very obviously is the inspiration for Sleeping Beauty. And although she never marries him for complicated reasons, she does kill herself in order to accompany him to hell after he dies. One poem that describes her journey to the afterlife is called Hellreið Brynhildar, meaning Brynhildr's Hell Ride. And in this poem, she gives an obscure but highly intriguing account of an event in her life that Larrington suggests is either a reference to a king confiscating the source of her Valkyrie powers to force her into a marriage, or it could be a reference to how she became a Valkyrie in the first place. Quote, "The courageous king had our magic garments, those of us 8 sisters, put under an oak. I was 12 years old, if you wish to know, when I gave my promise to the young prince. They all called me in Hlimdale, anyone who knew me, War Lady in the Helmet. Then I let the old man of the Gothic people, Helmet Gunnar, quickly go off to hell. I gave the young man victory, Auda's brother. Óðinn was very angry with me for that." End quote. This idea of magic garments appears to be related to something we get in the prose introduction to another poem called Völundarkvíða that sets up the events that lead to the capture of the hero Völundr by the evil king Nidudr. Quote, "There were 3 brothers, sons of the Lappish king. One was called Slagfid, the second Egil, the third Völund. They went on skis and hunted wild animals. They came to Wolfdale and there built themselves a house. There is a lake there called Wolf Lake. Early in the morning, they found 3 women on the lake shore, and they were spinning linen. Near them were their swan's garments. They were Valkyries. There were 2 daughters of King Hlodver, Hladgud, the swan white, and Hervor, the strange creature. The third was Olrun, the daughter of Kiar of Valand. They took them home to the hall with them. Egil took Olrun, and Slagfid, swan white, i.e. Hladgud, and Völund, strange creature, i.e. Hervor. They lived together 7 winters. Then the women flew off to go to battles and did not come back. Then Egil skied off to look for Olrun, and Slagfid went looking for Swan White, and Völund sat in Wolfdales." End quote. In this case, the 3 Valkyries own what the poem calls in Old Norse Alfdarhamir, meaning more literally swan skins. which Larrington translates to swan garments, because these Valkyries end up flying away, and we know that Loki often borrows similar bird skins from both Frigg and Freya, which allow them to transform into birds and fly around. It seems very likely that this is what's happening here, and also very likely that the magic garments mentioned by Brynhildr, which are also technically called magic skins in the Old Norse, are instances of the same thing again. But Valkyries don't always fly around battles in bird form, selecting warriors for Valhall from a safe distance above. In fact, Valkyries are often described as riding into battle like warriors. One particularly detailed description of the warrior motif being applied to Valkyries comes from stanza 15 of Helgakvida Hundingsbana 1. Quote, "Then a light shone from Logafell, and from that light came lightning bolts. Wearing helmets at Himinvangi came the Valkyries. Their burnies were drenched in blood, and beams blazed from their spears." End quote. So here we have an image of Valkyries as fearsome female warriors with weapons and armor quite literally covered in blood from performing their role of choosing the slain. It's things like this that make us think Freya in particular looks very much like a Valkyrie herself, as I've mentioned before. She has the magic bird skin, allowing her to fly. She rides into battle, and she chooses the slain. Although it is important to be clear that the sources never actually call Freya a Valkyrie, much less anything like Queen of the Valkyries, as some random online sources will sometimes claim. So getting back to this idea of choosing the slain, there's a common misconception that to choose the slain means to choose from among the slain. In other words, that lots of warriors die, and then from among those who died, the Valkyries choose which ones are worthy of Valhall. But what should be starting to become clear by now is that to choose the slain actually means to determine who dies. And this meaning is extremely consistent throughout the sources. We've already got Valkyries covered in blood, and an account by Brynhildr where she tells us Óðinn was angry with her for sending a man to hell and granting victory to another. But we also have Snorri telling us that Valkyries, quote, allot death to men and govern victory, and that they, quote, choose who shall be slain. If the account from Hellwraith Brynhildr was too ambiguous for you, there is a prose interjection in the poem Sigurdrifamal after stanza 4 that adds some additional clarity about the same event. In this poem, Brynhildr is called Sigurdrifa. Quote, Sigurdrifa brought down Helmet Gunnar in battle, and Óðinn pricked her with a sleep thorn in revenge for this, and said that she would never again fight victoriously in battle. End quote. Here's another example that doesn't even involve Valkyries. Vafthrûdnismal 41 describes conditions among the Einherjar, Óðinn's already slain warriors in Valhall who practice killing each other all day long and then get resurrected every day in time for dinner. It says, quote, all the Einherjar fight in Óðinn's courts every day. They choose the slain and ride from the battle. Then they sit the more at peace together. End quote. In this case, the phrase, they choose the slain, means literally that they kill each other. One last important illustration of this idea brings us back to the poem Grimnismal, where we learn about Folkvanger. Stanza 8 tells us, and this time in my own translation for maximum literalism, quote, the fifth is called Gladsheimr. There the gold-bright Valhall stretches out wide, and there Óðinn chooses every day who the weapon dead will be. So, with that understanding in mind, what does it mean when Grimnismal 14 tells us that Freya chooses half the slain every day and half are owned by Óðinn? In my opinion, it's a lot less likely that this stanza is trying to tell us Freya takes her pick for Folkvanger from among those slain in battle. Because remember, to choose the slain is to choose who dies. So I believe it's a lot more likely we're being told here that Freya and Óðinn have a compromise where they share in determining which warriors die. And if so, all of them may still be ending up in Valhall. We'll come back to this idea because it brings up a few pressing questions. And the one I think we ought to address first is why Óðinn and Freya would need to have any kind of compromise in the first place. We've been told that Óðinn sends the Valkyries into battle, where they allot death to men and govern victory. And various sources do strongly associate Óðinn with Valkyries. They are part of his entourage when he attends Baldur's funeral, for example. And of course, he is called the Valtyr, the god of the slain, who incites the princes of the world to battle so that he can harvest warriors for his afterlife army. But
Óðinn doesn't control fate, as we've talked about at length on this show, and fate is strongly associated with a person's time of death in the sources. So along those lines, we can start to raise some questions about how much control Óðinn really has over the Valkyries. Völunndarkvíða stanza 1 refers to Valkyries as beings who, quote, fulfill fate. And as we learn from Völuspá and other places, fate is determined by the maidens called Norns, not by the gods. We're even told that one of the Norns, Skuld, is in fact a Valkyrie herself. There's some really fascinating stuff happening here among these two groups of fate-entangled women, as well as with a third group called the Disir, who we haven't talked about much, but who Larrington believes are probably female ancestral spirits that serve almost like guardian angels. So, what happens when the god of the slain wants someone to be slain in a time or place that doesn't match what fate has decreed? How do you solve that problem? Obviously, this is a philosophical concept that is never dealt with directly in the sources, but I do think we see it being handled indirectly in a few places, most prominently in the story of Brynhildr, also known as Sigurdrifa. A moment ago, I quoted a small piece of a prose interjection from the poem Sigurdrifamal, but here's some more of it for some greater context. Quote, "She was called Sigurdrifa and was a Valkyrie. She said that there were two kings who were fighting one another. One was called Gunnar. He was old and a great warrior, and Óðinn had promised him victory. And the other was Agnar, the brother of Auda, whom no creature wanted to protect. Sigurdrifa brought down Gunnar in battle, and Óðinn pricked her with a sleep thorn in revenge for this, and said that she would never again fight victoriously in battle, and said that she should be married. Now in the voice of Sigurdrifa, and I said to him that I had sworn a great counter-oath to marry no man who was acquainted with fear." End quote. Why exactly Brynhildr/Sigurdrifa chose to disobey Óðinn's wishes is unclear. However, what's important is that we do have a very clear and famous attestation of a Valkyrie choosing essentially to rebel and not give Óðinn what he wants. It's a thing that can happen. And this seems to go along rather nicely with Óðinn's tacit admission in Lokasenna that he sometimes grants victory to the wrong side in battle. Here's that quote from stanzas 22 and 23. Quote, "Loki said, 'Be silent, Óðinn. You could never apportion war fortune among men. Often you've given what you shouldn't have given, victory to the faint-hearted.' Óðinn said, 'You know, if I gave what I shouldn't have given, victory to the faint-hearted, yet 8 winters were you beneath the earth, a milk cow and a woman, and there you bore children, and that I thought the hallmark of a pervert.'" End quote. In my opinion, we're probably seeing reflections of the Norse people trying to wrap their heads around why you might sometimes pray or sacrifice to Óðinn, or otherwise do everything right, and still not come out victorious in some battle. Maybe Óðinn gave victory to the wrong side, as Loki accuses him of doing. Or maybe a Valkyrie disobeyed Óðinn's orders. In any case, your victory obviously wasn't what fate had decreed. But psychological analysis aside, one of the main shapers of fate is a Valkyrie. And at least one Valkyrie, remember a being whose job is to fulfill fate, has gone against what Óðinn wanted. Since Óðinn doesn't control fate, it makes sense that he may not always get what he wants when it comes to fallen warriors. And if it's true that Freya fits the profile of a Valkyrie in her own role as a goddess, this might explain why a compromise on choosing the slain has shown up between the two of them in the sources. To me, it looks a lot like a compromise between the god of the slain and the women who are entangled with fate on determining who dies. One thing you may notice is that I haven't cited any scholarly sources for this interpretation so far. So to avoid this becoming an episode all about my own theories, I'll just point out here that I'm not entirely alone in this idea. Rudolf Simek asserts his opinion that, quote, "Freya chooses half the fallen heroes for Valhall, and Óðinn chooses the other half," end quote. Though on the other hand, to be fair, Lindow sides a little closer with Snorri, with his assertion that, quote, "Fólkvangr begins to look like some kind of alternative to Valhall, where the Einherjar dwell until Ragnarok," end quote. I want to make it clear that I am presenting a bit of an interpretation here, but there is a segment of scholars who agree with this view, and it's the interpretation I personally think fits most cleanly and easily into the overall system, that when Freya and Óðinn each choose half the slain, all of those slain are still arriving in Valhall. But if they all go to Valhall, what is Folkvanger? Well, as opposed to Valhall, Folkvanger is not a hall. The word itself appears to mean army plain, and like some of the other locations named in the list in Grimnismal, it has a hall standing somewhere within it. The hall where Freya arranges the seating isn't specifically named in the Poetic Edda, and if you'll recall, this list of locations in Grimnismal is sort of weird in that there are a few locations that seem like they might be synonymous with others. In that case, it's entirely possible that the hall is supposed to be Valhall, and the Folkvangr, the army plain, is maybe the surrounding area where Vafthrudnismal tells us that the Einherjar fight in Óðinn's courts every day. In fact, the word Larrington translates as courts is tunum in Old Norse, and it more literally describes an enclosed courtyard or field around a dwelling. Exactly what we might expect to find surrounding Valhall. But there's still something a little weird we need to deal with. Snorri gives us the name of Freyja's hall as Sessrumnir, although this name doesn't show up in the Poetic Edda, and we have absolutely no idea where Snorri got it from. Weirdly, he also tells us in a different section of the Prose Edda that Sessrumnir is the name of a ship. Simek believes that one of these two concepts, either the hall or the ship, might be a misunderstanding on Snorri's part. Hopkins and Þorgeirsson, on the other hand, suggest that a connection between Sessrumnir as a ship and Folkvanger can be seen in the existence of archaeological stone ship monuments which tend to lie in fields throughout Scandinavia. In that light, as well as in light of the Norse tradition of constructing burial mounds resembling ships, it's possible that Sessrumnir, as a ship, may be a flowery way of talking about the army plain as an afterlife location. In either case, it doesn't preclude a connection to Valhall, at least in my opinion. After all, Sessrumnir literally means seat roomer, and one of Valhall's most prominent features is that it is literally a gigantic room where thousands of people are seated. Unfortunately, there is nothing else ever said about Folkvanger in the sources, other than that Snorri tells us it exists in heaven. But based on what we have, it's my opinion that interpreting Folkvanger and Valhall as essentially the same place provides the best fit, especially with the mountains of sources telling us that Óðinn is the owner of all those who die in battle, and that entire armies can be dedicated to him by throwing a spear over them, and that sort of thing. We are also suspiciously lacking any discussion in our sources of anyone actually going to Folkvanger when they die. It makes sense to me that Óðinn probably does some of the slain choosing himself, and Freya, along with the Valkyries, probably do the rest, with all of the chosen slain ending up in Valhall, surrounded by an army plain, a Folkvanger. Now, we could stop here, but I've just made a claim that the sources never mention anyone going to Folkvanger when they die. However, if you are a huge nerd, you will be aware of one character who actually does mention an expectation of joining Freya after death. And that character is Þorgeirsson, the daughter of Egil, in Egil's saga. What I love about this instance is that it seems to tie all of these afterlife concepts together that we've talked about so far on the show into the lives and events of a single family. So I think it's worth digging into, although fair warning, you're about to get a whole lot of my own interpretation, a whole lot more than I usually let myself get away with, in fact. In Egil's saga, Egil Skallagrimsson is a farmer, a poet, and a Viking. At one point, his son Bolvar drowns in a boating accident, and Egil becomes severely depressed, essentially losing his will to live. Upon hearing about this, his daughter Þorgeirsson comes to visit him, with the intention of telling him that if he wants to commit suicide, she will do it alongside him, although her actual plan is to pull her father out of his depression. When she arrives, she is asked whether or not she has already had supper, and she replies by saying, quote, "No supper have I had, and none will I have until I join Freya. I can't do better for myself than my father. I don't want to outlive my father and my brother." End quote. Þorgeirsson then tricks Egil into believing the two of them will be poisoning themselves together. However, the poison is actually fake, and when their suicide attempt doesn't work, Þorgeirsson suggests that Egil should write a poem in memory of his son. Afterwards, if he wants to try again, they can try again. However, by composing the famous poem Sonatorek, Egil is able to deal with his grief and ultimately regains his will to live. But what exactly does Þorgeirsson mean when she mentions joining Freya? In my opinion, information about Egil's life and a couple of stanzas from his poem can help us decipher the riddle. Egil engaged in Viking, and even tells us flat out that he previously had good relations with Óðinn, which we'll see in a second. In stanza 18 of Sonatorek, he tells us, quote, "My son, the son of my wife, has arrived at the home of Óðinn to pay a visit." You'll notice, of course, that this son died in a boating accident, and this is not exactly the same thing as dying in battle. But if Jens Peter Schutt's idea is right, as we discussed in episode 11, that dedicating yourself to Óðinn by ritual is enough to earn you a place in Valhall, it explains very easily why Egil might expect his son to have arrived there. It's possible that this is a family that traditionally belongs to the cult of Óðinn. And by the way, when I use cult like this, I'm not using it in the colloquial sense of a crazy religion run by a con artist. I'm using it in an academic sense that means something more like a god who a person has chosen to cultivate a relationship with among many gods that may exist. That would be cult worship. Now, here's the thing. In stanzas 22 and 23, Egil explains that he's personally had a falling out with Óðinn, apparently over his sorrow for the loss of his son. He tells us, quote, "I had good relations with Óðinn. I had confidence in him, until Óðinn broke off friendship with me. I do not sacrifice to Óðinn, protector of the gods, because I am yearning. Nevertheless, Óðinn has, if I consider the better side of it, granted me recompense for my ills." End quote. So, whereas Egil previously cultivated a relationship with Óðinn through sacrifice, he considers Óðinn to have broken off friendship with him, and because he is yearning, he no longer makes sacrifices to Óðinn. As a result, in stanza 25, we get this, quote, "Now I am in trouble. Hell stands on the headland. Regardless, I shall await hell gladly, unconcerned, and with goodwill." End quote. The way I read this, Egil's family seems to have belonged to the cult of Óðinn, which is why Egil believes his son has gone to Valhall. However, Egil himself has ceased sacrificing to Óðinn, and because of this, his afterlife expectations have changed. Being disenchanted with the cult of Óðinn, he now expects to be received by hell. But if it's true that Egil's family is traditionally an Óðinn-worshipping family, maybe Þorgeirson's statement about joining Freya in death is a reflection of that. Maybe her expectation of joining Freya is a Norse woman's way of describing going to Valhall alongside her other Óðinn cult-initiated family members. But rather than joining the Einherjar, maybe she as a woman expects something else. Maybe she expects to become a Valkyrie or a member of the Disir. We're dealing with a lot of maybes here, but it's an exciting idea for me because if this interpretation is correct, this could be a possible attestation of the idea that non-warrior women can indeed go to Valhall under the expectation of joining Freya. Whatever the case may be, this saga does appear to deepen the connection between Valhall and Fólkvangr, in that the males in Egil's family are associated with Óðinn, while a female of the same family associates herself with Freya. Of course, all of this information ought to be taken in light of the idea that when a Norse person dies, maybe they just go wherever it is they believe they're going to go, for whatever reason they have that makes them believe they'll go there. I've made a big deal about an interpretation that fits well into an overall system here. But it's important to remember that there really is no universal canon of belief for ancient Norse paganism. For all we know, there could have been large swaths of the Norse population who had never even heard the word Folkvanger before, and had no concept at all of a half-and-half compromise between Freya and Óðinn. It's just impossible to know. It's also impossible to really know what the composer of Grimnismal had in mind when composing that weird list of locations. And of course, what seems strange and ambiguous to us may not have been strange or ambiguous at all to its intended audience. Simek believes that the notion of Folkvanger is, quote, surely not older than Grimnismal itself, end quote. And while I'm not sure there's really enough data to be quite so confident about that, it is entirely plausible that Grimnismal illustrates a notion of the afterlife that was unique to the 900s or later, or that was still in flux. It can be fun to consider questions like, what would Norse mythology be like if we didn't have Grimnismal? Or if we didn't have Vafthrudnismal? Or if we didn't have Voluspa? And then keeping in mind that there are well-known poems we know for a fact are missing, We can continue speculating and interpreting all we want, but we'll have to accept the fact that we probably aren't going to get everything right. But I, for one, remain undeterred. So let's keep getting everything partially right and partially wrong together next time on Norse Mythology, the Unofficial Guide. Sources for this episode include Dictionary of Northern Mythology by Rudolf Simek, 2007. Norse Mythology, A Guide to the Gods, Heroes, Rituals, and Beliefs by John Lindow, 2001. The Ship in the Field by Joseph S. Hopkins and Haukur Þorgeirsson, 2012. The Poetic Edda, translated by Caroline Larrington, 2014, and the Prose Edda, translated by Anthony Falks, 1995.